The lecturer is Professor Eric S. Rabkin. Dr. Rabkin is the Arthur F. Thurno Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. He received his Bachelor of Arts degree at Cornell University and went on to earn his Ph.D. at the University of Iowa. Dr. Rabkin has more than 160 publications, including more than 30 books, among which are The Fantastic in Literature, Stories, an Anthology and an Introduction, and Mars, a Tour of the Human Imagination. Dr. Rabkin has lectured widely to both general and academic audiences on a variety of literature topics, including fantasy, science fiction, fairy tales, humor, and literary theory. Dr. Rabkin has received many honors and awards for his teaching excellence, including the University of Michigan Distinguished Faculty Award, the LS&A Excellence in Education Award, and the Golden Apple Award, given annually by students to the Outstanding Teacher of the Year at the University of Michigan. Dr. Rabkin prepared the course guide that comes with these lectures. The course guide includes a detailed outline of each lecture, a glossary, timeline, biographical notes, and a bibliography. To get the most out of this course, you may find it useful to follow along with the outlines or review them before or after each lecture.
Hello, my name is Eric Rabkin, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this course on the fantastic. Fantasy often has a bad reputation. Something is a mere fantasy. Why, we can't do that. It's just a fantasy. Or in Freudian psychology, his problem is that he has that fantasy. But in fact, the fantastic drives us forward. We dream of what we may accomplish. We dream of a possible new world, and we shape our lives and the world around us accordingly. Who doesn't like a Cinderella story? If not the version that you learned as a child, then perhaps Julia Roberts in Pretty Woman. And when we want to express our fears, for example, of genetically modified foods, we call them Frankenfoods. Cinderella and Frankenstein's monster are characters that have walked off the pages of their books, and they share our lives. This course will explore the fantastic in literature and culture. Although we will naturally touch on ancient works like the Odyssey with its gods and its endless encounters with strange and marvelous beings, we will focus on works from the beginning of the 19th century onward for three reasons. First, this is the beginning of a mass reading public. In a sense, in other words, our era. Second, this is the beginning of the segmentation of the publishing industry by markets, which makes it possible to look at different varieties of work and see to whom they're expected to appeal. Third, from this point on, we can use solid knowledge of each author's life and culture in understanding the texts. Although the theoretical frameworks that we will develop to discuss the fantastic often apply universally, we will discuss primarily works from Western culture because our familiarity with that culture allows us to probe its works most deeply. These lectures are distributed into two parts. The first part focuses on the broad range of fantastic literary genres, from fairy tales to magic realism. This isn't just a broad range historically, but a broad range generically. In fact, detective stories are, according to W.H. Auden, those works that indulge the fantasy that hidden guilt may be revealed. Many different genres are, to one extent or another, fantastic, and the fantastic develops through time. We'll develop a theoretical framework for understanding the significance of the fantastic in general and look at specific works from a whole range of those fantastic genres. The second part of the course will focus on science fiction. Why? Because in our world, shaped as it is inevitably by the constant development of science and technology, forced as we are to live in a world whose material conditions make our lives different and hence our perceptions different, the only literature that genuinely engages those forces that change us is the literature of science and technology. That is to say, science fiction. For us, science fiction is the most important of the fantastic genres. But first, we need to understand the fantastic in general. And there is no better place to begin a study of the masterpieces of the imaginative mind than with the works of two scholarly brothers, Jakob and Wilhelm Grimm. These fellows set out to demonstrate not something about fairy tales, which is what they are most known for now, but rather the significance of German culture. And they did this half a century before there was a unified German state. What they wanted to do was demonstrate the antiquity and significance of German culture, that is, German language culture, although the German speakers were distributed among many different political domains. To do this, they sought to demonstrate the ancient roots of their culture. Although Jakob was a bachelor and Wilhelm married, Jakob very active and Wilhelm relatively frail, Jakob always traveling around the world and Wilhelm staying home, the brothers lived and worked together their entire lives, and only Wilhelm had children. They were, in fact, before they set out to collect fairy tales, folk tales, pioneering philologists. Philology is the study of language development, and in particular, they developed the very first law of phonological change. Phonology is that branch of philosophy of philology that concerns itself with the sounds of language. Now, we all know, if we know several Romance languages, that there are similarities. We know that it's trois in French for three and tre in Italian. And if we know several Germanic languages, we know it's three in English and it's drei in German. What the Grimm brothers discovered was that a certain class of sound changes regularly when it goes from the ancient languages to Germanic languages, but does not change when it goes to the Romance languages. That class of sound is called a voiceless plosive. A voiceless sound is a sound that does not engage your voice box. When you say that sound, you feel no vibration in your larynx. When you say that sound, you do feel a vibration in your larynx. Your voice box. Is voiceless, is voiced. Voiceless stops are sounds produced by stopping the air and then releasing them. P, t, k. What the Grimm brothers discovered is that voiceless stops in Latin, for example, remain voiceless stops in Romance languages, but become voiceless fricatives, that is, sounds produced by friction in Germanic languages. So the Latin pater becomes the French père, the Spanish padre, but the English father and the German Vater. Voiceless stops become voiceless fricatives in Germanic languages, but remain voiceless stops in Romance languages. There are three such sounds. P, t, k. Those sounds change. So we get pater, through, and, for example, cornu becomes horn in English, but remains corn, or a sound like corn. Casa, house, becomes house. We have those regular changes. Why? No one knows. But what it proves is that we can make a direct line from German right back to the ancient classical languages. In the same way, the Grimm brothers said, We have stories we were all raised on, stories that were transmitted orally, and these stories passed from grandmother to grandchild. These stories must have been the ones that are the most powerful in our culture. They must go all the way back. Now, there had been collections of fairy tales, folk tales, household stories before the Grimm brothers. Charles Perrault did a famous collection at the end of the 17th century, but his stories were really reworkings of stories that were well known, intended by their literary elegance to appeal to courtly readers. The Grimm brothers ostensibly wanted the true oral tale, and they sent their students, they were university professors, and they themselves out into the field, theoretically at least, to collect true oral tales. In fact, that is not quite what they did, as we will discuss in the next lecture. But they were supposedly getting true oral tales. When they gathered them together, they called them Kinder- und Hausmärchen, children's and household tales. They didn't mean this to be children's literature. They meant this to be the literature that gets told to children in the household context. In an agrarian society, when you can no longer work the fields, what is your use? Well, the grandmother, who may feel bitter because time has passed her by, can at least tend to the children who are not yet strong enough to go out and work the fields. So she tells them stories, and these are those stories. The Grimm's insight that folk tales or fairy tales are in some sense prehistoric has now been universally accepted. Their tales swept the European world and were almost instantly translated into many languages. Fairy tales, as the pioneering culture critic Walter Benjamin has said, are the first tutor of mankind. Benjamin identified fairy tales by their conventional ending, and they lived happily ever after. But I think most people today would identify fairy tales more likely by their conventional beginning, once upon a time. As soon as we hear that, we know we're in the land of fairy tale. We make a fantastic change and we expect talking animals and golden-haired princesses. If you read all of the Grimm's tales, you'll see that they begin in different ways, but they do tend mostly to have a single beginning, although they have wildly different endings. The beginning is, in den alten Zeiten, wo das Wünschen noch geholfen hat. In the olden times, when it was of use to wish for something. Now, we can understand what that means in a perfectly good, absolutely archetypal and well-known fairy tale like Rapunzel. It begins, there once lived a man and his wife who had long wished for a child, but in vain. So here we have the situation. We have the wishes. Will it be worth wishing after something? Indeed, what they have is a beautiful garden nearby, which the old wife can see from her window, and she develops a passion for the rampion that is growing in that garden. But the garden belongs to an old witch who has forbidden anyone to enter it. Still, she must have it, and her husband, who loves her dearly, one night climbs over the garden wall and comes back with the rampion. The woman is delighted. She feels wonderful and sends him again the next night. The next night, the witch finds the old man and demands with angry eyes to know what has gone wrong. The eye imagery is crucial throughout Rapunzel. Eye imagery is crucial throughout the world of fairy tales. I see what you mean. I have a perspective on this problem. What a brilliant idea that is, or am I being obscure? Can you see this through the cloudy presentation? Don't look at the world through rose-colored glasses. The association of sight imagery with knowledge is universal. And knowledge, even at the linguistic level, is related to conception. Conception of the mind, conception of the body. The witch looked at the old man with angry eyes, and he said, please be merciful rather than just, and explains why he has gone into the garden to satisfy his wife's urge for the rampion. If it is all as you say, the witch replies, you may have as much rampion as you like, but I shall have the child that comes from it. What child? No one has said a word about child except for the opening line that said, for a long time, the husband and wife had yearned for a child. The world of fairy tales takes much for granted. The witch understands that these are pregnancy cravings. The word for rampion, which is English, in German is Rapunzel. Rapunzel represents the vegetative power, the fertility that the mother has, but the witch does not. But the witch, like an anti-god, has her garden, and she must keep people out as God keeps Adam and Eve and their descendants out of the Garden of Eden. Ultimately, the witch takes Rapunzel and at about the age of puberty puts her in a tower which has no doors or windows down below, but only one window at the very top. It is clearly a phallic symbol. She lives there, Rapunzel does, and the witch comes to see her daily, climbing up Rapunzel's ever-lengthening golden hair. She calls out, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair. We know what let down your hair means. It means get loose. It may even mean take down your hairdo and get ready to go to bed. One day a prince comes by and hears this, sees the witch scamper up, and after the witch leaves, he calls, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair, and he scampers up. Soon thereafter, when the witch comes again, Rapunzel says, why is it that you come up so slowly and the prince comes up so rapidly? Prince? What prince? The next time the prince comes, the witch has lowered the hair tied to a nail. She's cut it off Rapunzel's head, a classic way of abusing fertile-aged women for having conspired with the enemy. As the prince gets to the top of the window, she pushes him, and he falls down onto the brambles down below, the thorns of which put out his eyes. Then the witch abandons Rapunzel in a waste and desert place, meaning a place of no fertility. Years pass, and the blind prince is wandering through the world. Rapunzel sees him. She throws herself on his neck. She cries piteously. The liquid, the tears from her eyes, water, a sign of fertility in all cultures. Go away for the weekend. Come back and add water to your plants. Go unpack and look at how your plants have suddenly gotten happy. Of course water is a sign of fertility. The tears, the water from her eyes, fall into the prince's eyes. His sight is restored. And the last scene we see is the two of them walking off so that he can go back to his kingdom, where he will become the king, with Rapunzel as his queen and the twin boy and girl they have born as the prince and princess. Twin boy and girl? Where did they come from? They came from that time up in the tower. In other words, what we have here is a story of female competition for the power of fertility. In fact, because of the use of the term Rapunzel, we know that this story actually goes all the way back to vegetation gods, to the time before writing, when indeed the great gods were female gods, before they had been supplanted by male gods. There are three key times for a woman in Grimm's tales. There is the asexual time of girlhood, there is the sexually active time of adulthood, and there is the postmenopausal time of old age. The witch is in old age. The mother in Rapunzel is fertile. Rapunzel grows through these ages. These continuing motifs, these pieces of story that occur in story after story, lend a kind of continuing power to fairy tales. We know that the Grimm's version is already Christianized. The thorns that put out the prince's eyes are like the crown of thorns that Jesus wears. But the underlying structure is clear, and we know that there's a competition among females. There is something called a motif index, created by Stith Thompson, a pioneering folklore professor at Indiana University, that traces the recurrence of these motifs from culture to culture. Cinderella gives us a terrific example of that. Cinderella is the story of a girl who is under the the domination of her stepmother and her ugly stepsisters. She wants to go to the ball so that she can meet her prince, but the stepmother says, well, you have to do housework, and takes a bunch of lentils and throws them into the cinders of the fireplace. Cinderella, Aschenputtel in German. If she can retrieve those, then she can go to the ball. In fact, birds come down and pick out those lentils for her, and she can put them back in a bag and gets to go to the ball, with the famous episode of the glass slipper and so on. To show you the staying power of this series of motifs, we need to ask, for example, where did that glass slipper come from? In Charles Perrault's version of Cinderella, Cendrillon, we have souliers de verre. Now, verre is in fact a comparatively rare word in French, V-A-I-R, and it is exactly the same word in English, but in English even rarer, V-A-I-R. It means squirrel fur. Right? She was wearing souliers de verre, slippers of squirrel fur. However, the word in French, V-E-R-R-E, verre, means a cup or a glass. It doesn't mean the material glass, which is cristal, but it means a glass, and is a glass of water, verre. And so English readers pronouncing the French story out loud saw Cinderella as wearing souliers de verre, glass slippers. Well, clearly you can't wear glass slippers. They don't have the flexibility to make it possible to dance in them at all. That particular detail is delightful, and we've kept it all this time. But we've only been able to keep it because it fits into the large story. How is it that Cinderella has these ugly stepsisters to deal with? I'm not sure, but the Greek version of the story, and I don't read Greek, but I've read the French translation of it, is called Cendrillon et les Sœurs Cannibales, Cinderella and the Cannibal Sisters. Her mom's dead because she's been eaten by these girls. She also has a fairy godmother. Where does that come from? I think it's reasonable to suppose that she is the spirit of the mother that is dead. Fairy tales teach us morals. We like to say that. Cinderella teaches us the moral that diligence is rewarded. One of my favorite tales is The Three Spinsters. In The Three Spinsters, we have a girl who will not do any housework. She is the opposite of Cinderella, and she is lying with her head on a window looking out into the street as her mother behind her is yelling at her to get busy. The queen, walking by, hears the yelling and goes upstairs and asks the woman why she's berating her daughter. Not wanting to admit that her daughter is lazy, the woman says, my daughter will just work and work and work all the time. She cannot be stopped. She's always spinning. She's always producing things. And the queen says, well, if that's as it is, let me take her with me. I may want her as a wife for my son. So the girl goes off to the castle. And there she is with her head on the window again, because the queen has left her with half a room full of flax to be spun into gold. Excuse me, into linen. And she's not up for it. But three ugly women go by, the three spinsters of the title. One of them has a big hanging lip. One of them has a splatted thumb. And one of them has a big splay foot. They say they'll do the spinning, but if there is a wedding, they must be invited as if they were the relatives. The girl readily agrees, and in fact, night after night, they spin for her ever larger amounts of flax, and she is given in marriage to the prince. The wedding occurs, and in come these three uglies. The prince says, who are they? The princess says, these are my cousins. How did they get to look that way? Ah, well, the one with the big lip was always trying to wet the thread. The one with the big thumb is always trying to spin out the thread. The one with the splay foot is always trying to work the treadle. Well, if that is as you say, the prince says, you will never spin again. The moral of the story? It's better to be a beautiful, lazy liar than diligent. In other words, fairy tales do teach us morals, but not necessarily the morals we think that they should tell. Fairy tales work with a fundamental, familial psychology. The fairy godmothers are marked, and mothers in general, by their desire to feed you. Witches are the anti-mothers, and they would eat you. In a true oral folk tale, no one ever says, I love you, they just give you food. No one ever says, I hate you, they just give you poison. Fairy tales collectively represent a world in which females exist, as I said, in these three states: asexuality, sexuality, and post-sexuality. The ideal state is the familial state before sexuality, as with the twins at the end of Rapunzel. Many fairy tales deal with common issues, like, for example, the anxiety that one might feel having to contemplate moving to a new stage of life with a greater sense of responsibility. We can see that by looking at a series of folk tales that deal with essentially that same structure. Little Red Riding Hood, Little Red Cap as the Grimm brothers call it, is a story about a girl, asexual, but at the point of menses. She's known by her red cap, right? That her mother in the village, a fertile female, sends with bread and cakes that Red keeps under her apron, thinking about the impending sexuality, to feed her old grandmother in the woods. Do not tarry along the way, the mother says, but Red, of course, does, because she's stopped by a wolf. We even today use the word wolf to refer to a sexual predator. The wolf says, why are you running along so fast? Look at all the wonderful flowers around you. Flowers, as anyone in an agricultural society would know, are the sex organs of plants. And Red stops. She looks at the flowers, and she starts gathering them, and we are told that she does not stop until her arms are so full that she can't hold any more. Then, only when she has no longer the physical capacity to gather flowers, does she get back on the path and go to her grandmother's hut, where, as we all know, she finds herself confronting a very odd-looking grandmother. In fact, it's the wolf who has eaten the grandmother. Now, the huntsman comes along, and he has a rifle, and he could kill the wolf, but for some reason he thinks, what if there's someone alive in there? And so he takes a pair of scissors and cuts open the wolf's belly. We have a kind of reverse birth. Out comes Red, out comes Granny. Red takes some rocks, puts them into the cavity of the wolf's belly, sews them up, and then the wolf, trying to escape, leaps onto the roof of the house, but falls down through the chimney into the cooking pot and is boiled to death. Red, in other words, kills the wolf. In Charles Perrault's version, however, the wolf comes in and just finds the wolf. The huntsman comes in and just finds the wolf. Red dies. And the explicit moral that Perrault puts at the end of the tale is, and so little girls should always obey their mothers. In other words, the child thinking of going out on her own, thinking of becoming more adult, thinking of being the feeder, thinking of having sexuality, fails to follow her mother's instructions and pays for it with her life. This is a compensation, symbolically, for those fears. And it says, just obey your mother. You'll be safe if you just obey your mother. What kind of a child needs that lesson? Maybe a 6-year-old. But in Little Red Cap, it says, I will never go into the forest again as long as my mother forbids it. Here, Red has escaped. As long as my mother forbids it. So, okay, this is maybe an 8-year-old. She knows it's dangerous, but Mom is her guide. In the version that's illustrated by Arthur Rackham, the child says, I will not go into the woods again until I am ready. So the new order is expected in some safe future. This is perhaps for a 10-year-old. Rapunzel is, in a sense, the same story. Right? It's the little girl who has had to pay and wait until eventually she can have her own sexuality. But there, the problem isn't caused by the child's foolishness. It's caused by the mother's carelessness. The new order of that child's sexuality and adult responsibility matures as the old order dies. We do not have a narration of the time between the prince coming to the tower and the prince finding Rapunzel again. In Sleeping Beauty, the girl falls backward when she pricks her finger on a spindle at the age of 15. And in Snow White, we have a 17-year-old who is made to fall into sleep by the poison of her envious stepmother. In other words, we have here 6 different stories, all giving the same psychological, symbolic problem, working it through, but with slightly different endings to help us deal with problems. Hansel and Gretel is a terrific story for understanding these psychological compensations. Hansel and Gretel is a story in which a stepmother has said, we don't have enough food, let's abandon the children in the forest. And the woodcutter gardener father agrees. Hansel has heard that this is the plan, and so as they go off into the woods, he leaves a trail of, not breadcrumbs, which we always remember, he leaves a trail of flints. And then they turn around and come right back. The next day, they're abandoned again. But this time, Hansel has left a trail of breadcrumbs. And the birds pick up the breadcrumbs. They wander in the forest lost, and they see a wonderful house of gingerbread and other goodies. They find themselves with a witch. The witch says that she wants to feed them, but in fact she claps Hansel into a cage and means to fatten him up so that she can eat him. She is the anti-mother. Gretel is set to housework. Every day, though, she gives Hansel an old chicken bone, and when the almost blind witch comes by to feel whether or not Hansel is getting fatter, he holds out the chicken bone. Eventually, the witch says, well, even if you're not getting any fatter, it's time to eat you, and she tells tells Gretel to fire up the oven. Gretel feigns inability. The witch does it instead. Gretel pushes the witch in. The witch is killed in the oven. Immediately, Gretel releases Hansel, and they go back. They find their way home almost instantly, sleep overnight in the forest, get on a swan's back to be carried across the river, and the last scene we see is them with their father, the stepmother in their absence conveniently having died. Consider the backstory. Like Cinderella's fairy godmother, I would like to suggest that this is a story about illicit desire. Children often want to supplant their parents. Stereotypically, girls want to supplant their mothers to marry their fathers. Boys supplant their fathers to marry their mothers. We don't have to go into sexuality and think of real killing. The fact is, children often want to be more important in the eyes of their parents than the other parent's position makes that possible for them. Consider a Gretel who wished her mother were dead. That is unreasonable. It can't even be thought of. But okay. Then there's a stepmother who comes along. Well, you could want a stepmother dead, especially one who would abandon you in the forest. But the stepmother gives pleasure to the father. You can't really want him dead. So you go into the forest and you meet a true anti-mother, the witch. She deserves to die. When you kill her, her double, the stepmother, is already conveniently dead. And so on her return, Gretel is at peace with her father and has saved her brother. In short, the story allows a symbolic compensation for having had the thought to kill one's mother. Grandmothers may be quite bitter about their waning powers. They may want to hurt, in some sense, their grandchildren. They can tell them horrifying stories. But they know that their stories are shaped in such a way that the child will win in the end. Take a child and throw it in the air, catch it, and listen to it scream in delight. The heightened terror is what allows for the heightened sense of security. By offering symbolic experience that satisfies both the teller, the grandmother, and the told, the children, we see that fairy tales deal with persistent human experience and have done so from before the beginning of recorded literature and continue to do so down to the present.